Hey guys, a little bit of a different video this time. In the past I've always just done updates and just kind of explained and pointed out a few things throughout the way. But I was given a request to actually show at least the way that I apply fiberglass cloth. So before we get started, you got to have your glass cloth material. It's either 6/10 ounce cloth or it's half ounce cloth. I got it from Balsa USA. It comes in a bag folded. I don't like the fact that it's folded. I'd rather it be on a roll, but it doesn't really matter. If you can see it right here, it's very thin, very pliable. So once you straighten it out, it's good to go. Basic things that you're going to need, obviously your finish resin. This is Bob Smith finish cure, 2-part. Obviously a cup to mix it in. And this is kind of an interesting subject depending on who you talk to. I like to thin my first coat of resin with the denatured alcohol, mainly for two reasons. You can go a lot further with a little bit of resin when you're thinning it down with the alcohol. But the main reason is because this is so thin, even though the resin is pretty smooth, pretty thin, still it can bunch up and actually kind of, wad up your cloth. So by thinning it down with the denatured alcohol, it almost turns it into the consistency of water. Now you only want to thin it if you choose to thin it for your first coat. Also, it being thinner, it's going to saturate the glass better and soak into the wood better, so you're going to get a better bond, in my opinion. There's a lot of guys that they're against thinning it, and other guys swear by it. I like to thin the first coat. And that kind of brings me to another topic here. I do 2 coats of resin. I know a lot of guys do 3. I've had great success just doing 2 coats. The first coat to apply the cloth, thinning it probably not a 50-50 alcohol to resin mix, but it's more like probably more like maybe a 70-30. I probably did the math wrong, but you get what I'm saying. I thin it to the point where I like it. You don't want to thin it too much, because then you're going to probably, it's going to have an effect on how the resin dries. But that's all a personal preference. Then once that's all done, I go over the flow coat with just straight resin, no thinning at all. And that flows out to basically a smooth mirror finish. So further down the road, as soon as I run out of the finish cure from Bob Smith, I'm going to be trying something else that was recommended by a couple friends of mine. And when I get to that point, I will bring you back and we'll discuss that and see how that works. Perfect time for the furnace to kick on. So right now, the majority of the fuselage is not ready for glass, but I can glass certain parts. So right now I'm doing the bottom of the fuselage. Once again, this is just the way I do it. I can't get away from my monocoat days of you always cover the bottom first. But the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to glass the bottom. The stabs are already glassed, both top and bottom. They're not flow coated. It's just one coat to adhere the cloth to the plane. Then once the bottom is done, I'll roll the fuselage onto its side, and then I'll do the side of the fuselage overlapping onto the top, and also doing the fin at the same time. So that makes more sense to me to do it that way. May not make sense to others, but hey, that's just how I do it. So I'm going to get some resin mixed up here and find a good place to set my camera, and we'll go ahead and we'll get this cloth stuck down. Alright, got it set up here on the bench. It's ready to go thanks to my nifty new tripod that I bought. This is what the epoxy looks like, or resin I should say, when I have it mixed with the alcohol. So as you can see, it's very thin, which is going to make it spread extremely easy. So for me, it makes the process a lot easier. To apply it, just cheap chip brushes from, I used to get them from Harbor Freight, but I got this batch from Menards. Still, you get a bag of, oh, what, 50 of them or so, and it's not very much. So use them once, throw them away. Let's get at it. Now, even though the glass cloth is really thin to start out with, it's very pliable. While I'm mixing my resin, I like to put the cloth on the plane and let it start to form around it. Just lay it on, kind of bend it around the curves a little bit, and just let it contour to the airplane. In my experience, it makes it spread a little bit easier. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a point to kind of start and work my way out towards one direction, and then I'll work my way out toward the other, and work my way out toward the edges of the airplane. So that way I don't get into a situation where I have the glass gathering at one point or getting wrinkles. So this looks like a good place to start. And once I get this all put on, I'll bring you in for a closer look and you'll see what it looks like once it's all put on there. This would be a good time to go to the bathroom if you need to, because this is going to be a boring few minutes here. I could think of a lot better things I would want to do than watch me put glass on an airplane. This is where I think having the resin thinned is very important, and at least the reason I like it is because I can do the back and forth strokes like this, and because it's so thin, it's not going to try to bunch up the glass. And it definitely helps to be in a well lit area, because you use the glare from the lights that will shine off of the resin, so it's easier to see if you miss spots. The nice thing about glassing is if you do happen to miss a spot, you don't have to get resin or glass cloth on every inch of the airplane. You don't have to. There are certain parts, like inside the air scoop, I'm not going to glass it. I'm just going to put the resin in there. The glass is mainly just for the strength. Back in the good old days, a lot of guys, and they still do this, would just seal the airplane. They'd have an airplane like this where it's all solid balsa construction, and they would just seal it with like a urethane paint, like a clear coat, almost like your like deck stain or something like that. Or just use epoxy and just seal the wood, do several coats of epoxy, and then paint it, and not even using glass cloth at all. But I figure might as well use the glass, just because it is adding a fair amount of strength, believe it or not. And I've been asked before on how do you know how much epoxy, or I keep saying epoxy, it's really resin, how much resin, how do you know how much to mix? It's kind of something you got to get the feel for. You're going to waste a little bit, that's for sure. But the nice thing about using the finish cure is that it takes a while to dry. So you can start out by mixing what you know is probably not going to be enough to finish it. Let's say I ran out right now. I can run back into my main shop area, mix up some more real quick, and come right back out and continue. but I just switched to a larger size cup. Normally I use a different type of mixing cup, so I'm not sure exactly how to gauge how much resin I'm using quite yet. So it's going to be, this is actually a, wouldn't call it a learning experience, but I'm figuring that out as I go. And I'm kind of excited for this finish cure that I'm using to run out, because the product I'm going to be using next has been widely talked about for quite some time, and now that I have a few good friends that have used it and really like it, so now I'm going to go ahead and give it a try. What I did on my top flight P51, at least on the wing, is I used the Minwax water-based polyacrylic to apply the glass cloth to the wing. And that was one of those things where a lot of people have done it that way and they liked it. I did it, and I just about got so upset with the way it turned out I almost crushed the wing and started over. So I'm not going to go into detail on why it didn't work out well for me, but it did not work out well. So when I built my top flight Mustang, I ended up using the Bob Smith, or maybe that one might have been Z-epoxy, I can't remember. But I ended up using an epoxy resin to do the fuselage, because the polyacrylic darn near destroyed my wing. Now normally you can't get away with doing back and forth strokes when you're applying the cloth, because you'll start to crunch and kind of wad up the material. But because I thinned my resin down, it's really nice and thin that way, and I don't have those issues. But once again, this video is not to say this is the best way to do it or this is the way it has to be done. This is just purely because I was requested. So Steve, this is for you, man. But I agree. I like to see how other people do things, even if I'm not going to change my methods or have no intent to change my methods. I like to see how other people do things, because you might find out that the way you've been doing something for 20 years, somebody else has been doing it an easier and different way. So it's always good to see how other people do things. Now right now I'm just kind of using the light above me to see any areas that I missed. I can see a spot right here where I didn't get quite enough resin on there. As soon as I'm done laying this down, I'll bring the camera over so you can see exactly what it looks like. So with your first coat of resin, you can still see the weave of the cloth. You can actually see it quite well, even once the resin dries. But once you do your second float, your second coat and your main flow coat, you'll no longer be able to see the resin. It's almost like putting a clear coat on your car. It covers up any imperfections. And just kind of going around, checking and seeing if there's any spots that I missed. Looks good to me. Sometimes you have to go back over areas where there's a curve like this, especially around the tail, and kind of work it down a little bit. And that looks pretty good. That will work. I know that's going to spill. Alright. So what we got is, you can kind of see by the reflection of the light, you can clearly see that the resin is on there. And we go for the opening where the tail wheel is, you can definitely see the difference. You know, get right up nice and close. It's probably hard to see through the camera, but you can kind of see the cloth, but the resin is starting to fill it out, to fill it in. And the whole purpose of this first coat is to mainly saturate through the resin and soak into the wood. And then your second coat, or if you choose to do a third coat, that's going to be your flow, which is going to make it come out super smooth. Now, what I was saying earlier about you don't have to have cloth on every inch of the airplane, like inside here, I'm not going to glass inside of here. In fact, I'm probably not even going to glass under here. I'm just going to hit this with some resin and sand it. But as you can see, I still got a lot of work to do on the nose, but I just like to get some of the glassing done and kind of do it in stages. Now, the one thing you don't want to do, and I'm going to highly recommend that this is the only way you should do it, is if you're going to piece it together like this, don't do a flow coat on anything until the whole fuselage is done. Because then you're going to end up with uneven amounts of epoxy. And what I mean by that is, you know, let's say, it's probably not crucial, but yeah, I think it's gonna not be the best way to do it. Let's say I flow coat the stab now. You know what? I do not want to listen to that furnace right now. All right. If I put the flow coat on the stab right now, and then finished glassing the fuselage, and then put the flow coat on the fuselage, I still have to blend this flow coat onto the stab, which has already been completely done. So now I have, you know, another layer of epoxy just right here that I'm blending into an already smooth surface. So then I got to sand that smooth. So piecing it together like this is not a big deal, but do not put the flow coat on until after everything is finished. Now, the excess cloth that's hanging off the edge, once this is all dry, I know a lot of guys take a knife and cut it off. I just use some 80 grit paper and just lightly hit it, and the sandpaper will cut the glass right off of there. And once the whole plane is glass with the first coat of resin, sand the whole thing with 220, and then go over it with the flow coat. And I know I've already showed you once, but I'll show you again. That's what it looks like. This is, trying to get a good angle on it here. This is just 2 coats of epoxy. The thinned first coat, which is to apply the cloth, and then a straight resin for the second, and that's the final flow coat. And I see no reason to put a third. It's already so nice and smooth. Hitting it with the automotive filler primer that I like to use will fill in any imperfections, and we'll be good to go. But once again, that's a personal preference. I'm not going to say that doing a third or even a fourth coat of resin is wrong by any means, because it's entirely up to you. So that's that. As far as glassing goes, building and finishing airplanes, fiberglassing is probably the easiest thing to do. I honestly don't know how you could screw it up, because it's what you just saw. That's it. It's that easy. The only reason I don't care for glassing is just because of the time that it takes to do it. You got to do it in steps. You know, there's lots of sanding involved, and then priming and painting. Of course, when you glass an airplane, now you have the option to do a lot of scale details. But for me, I'm more of a flyer than a builder. I like to have a nice looking airplane, but it doesn't necessarily have to win beauty pageants. So taking an airplane in this state and monocoating it, I'd be flying it next week. But, you know, I'm not going to monocoat this airplane. No way. And kind of a close-up view of my top flight Mustang. You can see some of the rivet and panel line details. This is all done over fiberglass and epoxy. And you can't really get that type of finish from a monocoated surface. You can to a point, but if you're going to do any kind of detail work, you need to glass the airplane. So that's that. Later.